And good evening to our fellow followers and listeners. Tonight is Sunday, February 4th, 8:20 p.m. This is Federico Lines of States Rights Radio, and Seth Hancock of Seth Hancock Reports won't be joining us tonight, but we have...
Cody Holt with All In on America.
And tonight's episode is Disaster at the Border. Who created this disaster? Who truly has the power to enforce the border situation of all 50 sovereign states? I mean, this is a very interesting topic because, as everybody will know, that my first book, State Sovereignty, The Power Lies With Us, Not the Federal Government, in Chapter 4, it's Across State Lines and Immigration, I set the precedent that Congress established a clause while I believe it is the power of the states to enforce and regulate the immigration and naturalization services, as we have seen it in 1798, when Thomas Jefferson and James Madison opposed the Alien Sedition Act. And then you've had a few other individuals like John C. Calhoun. I know many people don't like John C. Calhoun, but he made a reference to that the states have the power to control the naturalization clause. So I've taken upon to really study it and all that and really make the judgment call that the federal government has no right to enforce the federal immigration. I don't believe so. I believe they've taken too much power into it, and this is why we are in the mess that we're in. And that's why we're seeing a lot of trouble in Texas, New Mexico, California, even Florida for that matter. And I'll share a little story about Florida in the 1980s. But that's just my main, I think the federal government has created this disaster, has created a really massive level of unwanted bureaucracy, not to mention 2001 with the creation of the Department of Homeland Security that has nothing but disaster. So, I'm going to open to my other co-host, Cody, to see what he thinks and see if we can, come up with the answers on who created this disastrous border situation from all across the states.
Yeah, no, this is actually this is unique because I have before actually kind of looking into your perspective on this, Federico. I've actually never even thought about the states having the duty and the responsibility of enforcing border security and immigration. It's still something that, quite frankly, I might need to get sold on a little bit. Mainly, throughout my entire life, I've always believed it to be the role of the federal government, but I can understand where you're coming from on the issue. But with regards to that, I guess my position is, and I think this is going to be great because I think we're going to have a healthy debate.
Sure.
My perspective is, right, so all the states, we're all part of the union, and we send our elected representatives to Congress, and they're kind of acting on behalf of the voters in those states for the federalized government over them. And I think we agree that the government should be limited, and the federal government should be limited in its scope and its size, and really kind of what it does. And there's no disagreement that it's overstepped the bounds on that. So, I guess my question, I kind of want to just maybe bounce the idea off and see, what your thoughts are, because you've done a lot of research into this subject. So let's say the states had that control right now, and you had California with just a radical open border policy. Anybody can come in our state. We're not going to enforce any border restrictions with Mexico. So in my eyes, it creates a lot more border to defend with regards to Oregon, Nevada, and Arizona. So then it would be up to the voters and the representatives in those states to protect their borders. Would that be kind of fair?
Well, I mean, what I've come to learn is that regarding money issue, because for example, 2016, 2015, but let me go before we get to that money issue. Let's say the state of California creates its own immigration policy, not following federal immigration law. which that was the death of Arizona versus the United States 2012, and we can get to that in a bit. But let's say if California creates its own immigration law and allows a flood of immigrants to come in. If, let's say, Mr. and Mrs. Jaime Rodriguez of Guatemala moves his family to Nevada, and one of his children commits a crime in Nevada, in Las Vegas or Reno, wherever, and he gets arrested, and that it's up to that state to set a code for immigration. So if it comes to joining, it's up to each individual state to set up a code to keep its residents, whether legal or illegal, in check and in line. And that's where I realized in 1976, the Supreme Court gave the right to the states, and the Canas versus Bica, the right to enforce employers, who they hire and all that, and don't have to go through the either federal W-4, W-2, and their own employment status. And yet again, in 2020, the also Supreme Court in Kansas versus Garcia also gave that level of authority to the states to enforce it on employer and employee, and checking their and don't have to go through the W-4 status under the 1986 Immigration Act, IRCA, passed by Ronald Reagan. So it all comes back to the autonomy of a state, and again within the constitutional bounds. Now, I'm not saying that what Ron DeSantis and Governor Abbott did, that he got a whole bunch of illegal undocumented workers and shipped them off to Martha's Vineyard. I don't believe that was a true meaning of what the framers meant, that states have the right to enforce the naturalization clause. I do believe that Florida, as well as Arizona, have a right to deport people if they are there illegally or not illegally out of their state and all that. And then it comes back to monetary issue. Like, for example, in 2015, where Donald Trump was saying that we want to build a wall, what a beautiful wall. I mean, do I want my tax dollars going to Texas and infrastructure in Texas, within the Texas sovereign land? I know it borders an international board and all that, but it's still an infrastructure of Texas. It should be Texas' responsibility, as it is with Montana, with Canada, or even anywhere else, Florida for that matter, with borders with Cuba. So I don't believe on monetary issue the federal government has a right to pass that type of legislation or enforcement, without the consent of the states, which again, there is no consent because Congress can do whatever it wants. So that's my main kind of thing, is that it gives too much power to the states, monetary-wise and enforcement-wise, and it kind of diminishes that sovereign rule that the states have.
Sure. Yeah, actually, I think that's actually a pretty... it's a unique perspective, and actually it makes more sense hearing you explain a little bit more to me. Where it's not like Nevada erecting, 1,200 miles of border wall, right? Theoretically, it's enforcing, citizenship policy on the people who are within the borders of the state of Nevada, for example. So, I think states should absolutely have that right to, to be able to deport. And I also agree with you that, Ron DeSantis and Abbott shipping the immigrants up to Martha's Vineyard, it was more of kind of like a political stunt. We see it happening here in the Chicagoland area all the time. I was in Chicago last weekend, and it is definitely not the city I remember from when I was a kid. You do see the migrants camping under causeways and things of that nature. But I think the point that they were making was kind of valid. It was that, it's not just Texas being a border state, but they're trying to make that political point that all states are a border state if you have a federal government that is neglecting the border, which is what we're kind of debating today. But I guess within the current paradigm we're in, so, it is the government, the federal, currently it's accepted that the federal government is enforcing that border policies. And how do you start to educate people with regards to, maybe this isn't how we should do it. Maybe this is a different, there's a different way of doing it, and here's what our founders intended.
Yeah, no. What I do, what I've said multiple times to many people that have a centralized policy, whether you're a Democrat, Republican, or liberal or conservative, is that many people are not aware that it is the federal government that has instituted very totalitarian and centrist policies. For example, I don't think the Civil War would have been that bloody or that long if the Supreme Court would have just told Wisconsin, if you want to accept Dred Scott as a free citizen, as a free person, and induct him as a citizen, then I don't think, because of that case, that's one of the reasons that this country went to war with itself. And even after the Civil War, Congress tried to pass a lot of acts that really shade a negative eye towards immigrants, Chinese immigrants. That was, the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1875. That was a very racist act. And, the United States, and I keep telling people it is the federal government that has, southern states really made a lot of racist laws, segregation, all that, but the federal government has really made it a precedent to those states to enact those laws. You had the Chinese Exclusion Act. You had Dred Scott versus the United States that led us to a civil war. You had Korematsu versus the United States that allowed the federal government to imprison Japanese American citizens and German American citizens. And you had in 1939, you had Jewish refugees trying to seek asylum, and the federal government refused entry. So this is something that and even to that effect in Florida, I remember that my political science professor said that she was telling stories about the former governor of Florida, David Schultz, who was Jewish. And he was actually trying to persuade the current governor of Florida, trying to let them in because, these were refugees trying to get away from Nazi Germany. So that's one thing that I've tried to tell people is that, federal government has initiated these type of policies that are not right for America, and try to look at for that perspective. And, the other thing is that, when I mentioned before that, states have a right to enact their own immigration policy. What they don't have a right is to copy or accept cooperation with the federal immigration law, with federal union officials. There was one reason that James Madison, the father of the Constitution, gave the states the right to refuse to cooperate with federal immigration law or federal union officials. And that's what killed it with Arizona versus the United States. Now, I know Texas is trying to hear the case with the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court has said to them that they have to remove the barbed wire. But yet again, in Arizona versus the United States, Arizona officials crafted a law that actually was cooperating with federal immigration law, and that's why that Supreme Court ruling did not favor Arizona. So that's also, I know many people when they hear about Joe Arpaio and stuff like that, they call him a loon, and all that, and but yet again, he's following his state law, and he's a sheriff. So, number one, look at the federal government history and look at the savageness that they've done to exclude immigrants and to really create racism and diversity. And number two, look at your own sovereign state, and it's your own money going to wherever. Now, for example, one last thing is Idaho is trying to send money to Texas. That's a little bit waste of taxpayer money from Idaho. Unless the voters will reach out and say no, but Idaho should put that money within their own borders, not going to Texas or Arizona. So, we are, I always coined the phrase, we are a republic of sovereign states, not a democracy of sovereign states. And people need to understand that.
Yeah, and those examples that you just pointed to with regards to the Chinese Exclusion Act or the denying of Jewish refugees during the early parts of World War II, those are actually just regular immigrants that were seeking to come into America. These weren't people who were seeking to cross the border illegally or enter a country illegally. I guess that goes to another point that our government, our federal government, our bloated federal government, with just an expansive social welfare program, just in general, incentivizes people to come over illegally and participate in these programs. And even some states encourage. I know here in Illinois, we encourage, or the state government encourages people who are in our country illegally to seek state services that are taxpayer funded. So, it's kind of the incentivizing. It makes you wonder why somebody from, say Venezuela, who crosses the Darien Gap and makes their way through Central America, why they don't stop in Guatemala or Mexico, right? It's like their ultimate end goal is here in the United States, and I think it's because we incentivize people, and it's not just, by the way, it's not just people from Central and South America, but it's people from Africa, it's people from Europe, it's people from Asia, it's all around the world, who are in economic straits that don't see any, they want to come over here, and it's, there are some who legitimately want to work when they get here, but it's definitely a huge driver of people wanting to come to the United States because the government, in their eyes, will take care of them.
Yeah, and the unfortunate, sad business is that the congressional delegation of many of those states, your unfortunate delegation of Illinois with your two senators, Tammy Duckworth and Richard Durbin, they get money from the federal government and they pump it into your state, saying, okay, you got this money now, bring in, either illegal labor or whatever, and give these citizens, give these residents all the money they can. And it's all over the place. Even here in Florida, you had a vast Cuban majority in the congressional delegation of Cuban representation that they accepted multiple millions of dollars from the federal government into Florida to accept Cuban refugees and all that, and make them, and strip and not apply the anchor baby status. And it's funny. I know. Have you seen the U.S. version of Shameless TV series?
Yeah, I've seen a few episodes.
Yeah, it's funny that there was one episode. It takes place in Chicago, on the south side of Chicago, and something that really, it's true to real life in Chicago lifestyle, where what's the actor's name who plays the deadbeat father? Jeez.
Well, I'm no good with actors. No.
Yeah, I mean it'll come to me. The character of the deadbeat father is telling one of his daughters that she's gonna apply for social services because she has pregnant. So then he's telling her all the things that will apply. If she has twins or her baby is mentally challenged or deformed, then she gets this amount of money. I'm like, wait a minute, how the world? Can Illinois afford that? And of course, it's because they create this incentive programs for illegals and even U.S. citizens. Handouts to all kinds of people, and that's the problem. It's these type of politicians that create these incentives, not only in Chicago or in Illinois or Indiana or wherever. And they have this mentality of a welfare system because the federal government has created this existence language on the welfare clause that we have a right to protect them, not for welfare, not for the central government or state governments are not there to create a safety net. But yet again, the federal government has created this safety net. And then, in a few last episodes, Seth and I were discussing where Nikki Haley and DeSantis were saying to protect Social Security. And this is the idea where the Americans where the majority of American citizens have said, well, you know what? I got the federal government over here. I'll just accept a stimulus check or whatever, like the safety net. And it's very sad. And this is where many immigrants have also seen this idea, and that's why they come here. And it's great they want to come here, because I know some of them, they want to work, they want to they want to have a better life than they have in Somalia or in India or wherever, and that's fine. But we cannot have them by the millions, and yet the way that the federal government operates, unfortunately, I am really against ICE in the way they're doing it, or the Border Patrol. It's just too much bureaucracy, and they can't do it. And Scalia, may he rest in peace, when he listened to Arizona versus United States, he said in an interview that the Attorney General came to argue in this case, and he says that we're not prepared to take Arizona to protect because of financial problems, manpower problems, etc. And Scalia says, okay, fine, perfect. If you don't have the manpower, you don't have the finances, then it's the state's responsibility to supplement that with their own law. I mean, yet again, Arizona went far more to use federal immigration law to protect their borders, which they shouldn't have, but they do have a right to supplement their own law. And, quite frankly, people need to bring aware that, it's not the federal government's responsibility on many aspects. This is not one of them. This has never been one of them. The Supreme Court just gave it to Congress, and Congress just took the power to do it. And people, in my opinion, people need to really understand the concept of these states to either work together or not work, or work together to preserve this union, not to secede, not to just to preserve it, and preserve it with the Constitution. And I do hope people really understand that.
Yeah, and so let me ask you another question, because I think this is bringing up many great ideas with regards to immigration that people, especially people listening, probably may have never heard before, or it might spark a thought in their mind. So with illegal entries into our country, there also comes forms of crime, right? Unfortunately, there's crime associated with it, whether it's human smuggling, narcotics, organized crime activity, things of that nature. I know that currently we have 1 billion different federal agencies that deal with this, whether it's Homeland Security or ATF or ICE or the FBI or even CIA with counterintelligence, whatever, right? It's so bloated. You have so many bureaucrats focused on this, and it's not really actually doing anything, mind you, that we spend all the money on these agencies, and it's not really stemming or curbing the flow of these activities. So in an America where the states should and would have the right to go after enforce immigration law, right, and deport people, are we also asking the states more or less to empowering them to combat those illegal activities that come with the illegal immigration? Or do we keep some federal agencies with law enforcement agencies and the Department of Justice to go after those individuals that cross state lines?
Well, that is a very good question, Cody. The only accepted federal government police that I support is the federal marshals. The FBI, the ATF, DEA, I don't believe they have any constitutional authority, and they shouldn't even they shouldn't exist. The federal marshals, yes, because that's the only police authority that there is. And so if a illegal alien or undocumented worker crosses into the border, and he commits a crime in Florida, but then he moves into Georgia, then it is up to the federal marshals to capture him and send him back to Florida to stand trial for justice. But that's a good question, because I just finished watching a documentary on the cocaine cowboys that happened in South Florida, hence the city that I live in the 1980s. There were multiple murders made by a lot of members of the drug cartels from Colombia. And then came the Mariel boat lift of the 1980s, where Fidel Castro just opened up his prisons and just dumped this wave of criminals. Some were good people, don't get me wrong. The Mario boat lift did have people that did want to escape Castro's Cuba and all that, but a big chunk of that Mario boat lift were criminals, and they came here. Did the federal government do something to stop it? No, and that's the problem is that, you have, again, very, bleeding heart politicians and bleeding heart bureaucrats that want to help these individuals, and you can't help criminals. You really can't. So if the state of Florida would have had access to enforcement of the naturalization clause, I think that they would have been deported back to Cuba. They would have sent boats back to Havana Harbor and send them back, and really did a double check on their identity status and all that. But again, here comes the red tape, lack of the red tape, uselessness of the federal government, that they let this gang of wave enter South Florida, Miami, and you had multiple murders all across Miami and all across Dade County and Broward County. So you're always going to get a wave of crimes when there's an undocumented worker, but it's up to the states to bring them to justice. Now, it is unfortunate, but states do have that murder charge and to bring them to justice. If he escapes Florida, if he moves Florida to Georgia and he commits a crime in Georgia, it's up to the state of Georgia to bring him to justice. It's not up to the federal government, and there should not be no FBI or any of that nature. But typically, for example, in Kansas, where there were 3 undocumented workers that they stole Social Security numbers and applied to them, and when the state figured out, state prosecuted them, but then the federal government stepped in and saying, no, we are responsible here, we'll take that, and yet again it creates confusion. Well, the states have these people in custody, but you're coming in and you're going to take them away. What is this? This power grab, this control. Federal government, that's not the responsibility of the federal government. It's up to the state of Kansas to say, hey, there's 3 individuals that committed identity theft. We're going to prosecute them. We're going to set the record straight. You have no authority here. And the Supreme Court actually said that IRCA stands with no authority, passed by Ronald Reagan. And, the same thing would happen with the 1924 Immigration Act, where, again, this is another one that's very racist, where the federal government set standards, racial quotas on immigrants. People have to understand that the majority of these laws that target immigrants are coming out of the U.S. Congress, not by individual state legislatures, the U.S. Congress. So my bottom line is that, states should really start enforcing their own immigration law, and don't have to really cooperate with federal immigration law. And just one more last thing, I know that DeSantis is enforcing E-Verify, and I think several other governors are enforcing E-Verify. They don't have to do that. They don't have to. They can create their own E-Verify status. Let the federal government regulate E-Verify and have their states run their own E-Verify status. It comes to a time where people have to understand how this country was established. And I'm a naturalized citizen, Cody, and I love this country, but I started to really learn how this country was built upon. And me coming from a central authority status of a nation, I don't like it. I don't want a central status of authority. I want how this country was built, individual states, with a central government to only what it's meant to be. So, I'm not going to be a big proponent of federal government. I never have been, and hopefully never will.
Yeah, no, it's very, it's an idea that I'm personally, I guess, flirting with, right? I think it's really awesome, and I think it's a very idealistic, way of looking at it. It's I guess the word I'm looking for is it's unique, but it's not unique because the founders, it was kind of their intention for states to do that. And if you look at everything going on with regards to federal involvement, I just want to go really back to the crime aspect too. You have federal agencies that make money off of illegal activities like that, like the CIA and with their gun running and narcotics trafficking. So it's it's agencies that are supposed to be stopping it, that are promoting it, and you get really in the weeds, and people's jobs start to get on the line. They have to maintain their livelihoods, and they want to kind of maintain the system that they don't want broken up. And I think that's probably true as the federal government has grown in size since its founding. You've got more of these entrenched career bureaucrats, civil servants, whatever you want to call them, right? And their livelihoods depend on a large, thriving federal government. And that includes maintaining the status quo with immigration. So maybe it does just need to have we need to push a reset button. We need to find that reset button and push it and go back to where it was before. I'm not 100% sold, but I'll tell you what, my friend, you made a very, at least to me, a very, very, very persuasive argument.
Well, I mean, here's another thing is that, you mentioned CIA with the narcotics trafficking and the connection that the CIA has opened its doors to that. And, remember that the CIA was one involved with drug trafficking with Nicaragua, with Colombia, running their monies in order to provide arms to the Contras. They help the narcos, the narco traffickers help them with that and all that, and a lot of money that helped those Contras came from drug money. So the CIA and the DEA, I would say, is a little more friendly, more against that. But the federal government has never really been keen to stop the drug and wars or the war on drugs and stuff like that. So it's the federal government has become too big and powerful, and yet people just. I don't know if they want to, again, because of the Senate representation that they have in their states in Congress, and their own representation in Congress and as well in the states, they actually says, let the federal government run it. That's why, I spoke to a libertarian candidate in Indiana, and I told him about this, and the guy said, well, federal government has this authority and blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, well, not really. I mean, for a libertarian, you sound like you want a big federal government. So, I mean, that's why I'm really not for political parties anymore, because wherever I see a political party candidate, he's always preaching for a federal government, for a vast power of federal government. So, you're the second person that has actually, has heard this kind of thing. And the first one was a good friend of mine, Rick Jor. And he was a former state rep in Montana, and he says he coined the phrase that you're actually the first person that I've ever read that insists that states have a right to enforce Article 3, Section 8 of the Constitution, which is the Article of Naturalization. And that's basically I tried to convey that message. But let me ask you something: when you served in the school board, did you ever have any issues like this come up in when you were in the school board?
We never really had an immigration issue. I remember I was elected in 2015, and when I say we, first off, let me preface that with we have had, we served a lot of families who were here illegally, and what I say is, we've never addressed immigration as a school board. I guess that's the more apt way of saying it. But I will say I was elected in 2015. Then Donald Trump was elected in 2016. And then everybody kind of went crazy in, the administration. And, they wanted to put out the virtue signaling thing saying, well, we're going to continue to serve all students and blah, blah, blah. Whatever. But they kind of started to make immigration an issue, regardless of immigration status, we're doing this and blah, blah, blah. And it's like they kind of picked and choose, what from the federal government they wanted to listen to. It's on immigration stuff, they would be like, oh, no, we're not going to listen to the federal government's guidance on immigration. But on transgender bathrooms or something, we're following the federal government on that. And it was they didn't want to defer to local elected officials like myself or Jeanette Ward or Phil Costello, the three conservatives or anything like that. They wanted to toe the line, and the board majority, which was liberal, wanted to follow whatever the federal government said, unless it was something that Donald Trump or one of his appointees, put out there, like Betsy DeVos and those people. So we never really got nationalized. But what I will tell you is, just to go back briefly to what I was talking about with regards to like the entrenched federal bureaucrats, in every local government, you have entrenched local government bureaucrats. And those people, they get paid, they come into work, they work Monday through Friday, 9 to 5, banker hours, they get their pension, but they know that their livelihood depends on them retaining their job and making sure you don't limit the size and scope of government. So they'll make recommendations to like department heads and department chairs, that when they go to the board or the elected people who have power over them, they know how to placate many of these people. And that's kind of, it's like in a microcosm, it's kind of like what Congress is, I'm assuming, right? Like you have all these career bureaucrats and all these departments that set up their budgets, and they know how to placate, they know how to lobby. And there's only a few people who are interested in actually governing and actually, grounded in their philosophical thinking and not for their own personal political benefit. I guess if that makes any kind of sense.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. There are certain bureaucrats that want to abide by the Constitution and what their authority is, and there's other ones that just want to collect a paycheck and not really just create new rules just to make sure their job is safe and job security, and that's fine. I understand that, but I mean, because of that lazy bureaucrat, Montgomery County, Maryland is one of the richest counties in the United States because of that level of bureaucracy. The same thing with Loudoun County in Virginia. So you have that sense of ignorance per se and laziness in the federal bureaucracy level, and and going back, in 2015 where Donald Trump was running for office, and I just want to point out that he made a statement in Good Morning America that when he was proposing a Muslim ban, he coined that he wasn't doing any different than what FDR did. And I'm like sitting down and I said, so you actually agreed of imprisoning? I mean, I know the Muslim ban, there are certain people in the Middle East that, that tend to be dangerous to American society and all that. But I mean, there are other ones that also do want to make a living and want to make a change and bring forth their family. So I said to myself, does he really support FDR's decision to imprison Japanese Americans and German Americans and Italian Americans? I never understood that quote that he said in Good Morning America. But besides Donald Trump's message and all that, infrastructure, and this is something that many people are not quite aware, that infrastructure doesn't lie within the federal government. I know many people are happy Eisenhower passed the Interstate Highway Act and all that, but yet again, I mean, James Madison vetoed a public works bill precisely that, because it's not the function of the federal government to invest in infrastructure. Well, I mean, so
if I could.
Sure.
Could I just jump in really quick on
that?
Yeah,
sure.
Because I think it's a very interesting. That's a good point. I know Eisenhower. He obviously got a lot of inspiration from the for the highway. The highway program and the interstate highways from Germany.
Yeah.
From the Autobahn, because it was a great way of moving tanks, and Germany was able to move tanks, military equipment across the German state very easily. And again, it's very centrally planned, and that is a centrally planned government bureaucrat idea, right? Like, that is something big government is. Sorry, I wanted to point that out.
Oh, no. Thank you for pointing that out, because I do believe that, when it came time for the election in 1952, and if the Republican Party would have given its backing to Robert Taft, I strongly believe that Robert Taft would never have signed that act into law, Mr. Republican himself. And Eisenhower, I mean, he was a great general. There's no dispute about that. As well, the same thing as George Washington and Ulysses Grant and Zachary Taylor. They were good generals. But as federal bureaucrats, as presidents, I mean, even George Washington, who's the father of the nation, but I don't believe that George Washington was a good president. I think he was a better general than president. The same thing with Grant. The same thing with Eisenhower. I don't know how strongly you agree with this statement, but or you disagree or whatever. But I would like to hear your thoughts. But I do believe that people like that who are military, they shouldn't be running for it. That's why I was kind of scared when Wesley Clark in 2004 was thinking of running for president. And no, we don't want military personnel to run for president because they're gonna suck at it.
It's weird because they're all these people, right? Like in history, they've held really, 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 really high approval rating. Mm-hmm. With the American public, that includes General Sherman, right? Like they were trying to recruit General Sherman to run.
Oh yeah,
and even more recently, I guess the current general that has the most popularity or had the most was General Mattis, and again, he was very well liked. He was passed to become Secretary of Defense. Literally, I think with only like one no vote or abstention in the Senate, if I'm not mistaken. So like they hold really high popularity with the people. But it could be a very dangerous thing to have somebody like that in charge in modern political times, mm-hmm. right? Like my coworker and I sometimes will have a debate because he's a military guy, and his belief is to serve, in Congress. He believes that you should serve in the military, or to be like an elected official like that, you should serve in the military, and it's kind of drilled in people who have served, right? Like they see a lot of value in it. I do too. God bless every man and woman who served our country. I could not do it. If I needed to, I would. But I found other ways to serve. But it's a mindset, and it's not a civilian mindset. And I think you need to have that civilian oversight on the military and a commander-in-chief. It should not be somebody who, everybody in our military looks up to, right? And like, okay, he's a military guy. He's with us. Now he's in command of all these troops, and they all know him or her, right? I mean, that's kind of a dangerous thing.
No, it is. Oh,
and you've seen it in history too. You've seen it in many different parts of the world, whether they're developing nations, third world nations, even first world nations, that military people who have a large following in the military, when they're no longer in political power, they yield that political power with the military to go back into power.
Yeah, no, you're right. And in other countries, they're very customary to use the military for that populist power, and we've seen it in developing countries in Africa, Asia, Europe, Latin America, and South America more than Central America, but yet again South America too. But but with retrospect here in the United States, when you see the federal government instituting policy like that, like infrastructure building, whether it's a highway system or a wall building or whatever, it's national money. And I don't think that, if Texas wants, because then, Texas says, oh, you know what? Washington, D.C. sending its own funds into building this wall or federal or border protection, that's great. Then we'll focus our money somewhere else on our own welfare state or whatever. And I think that's very shady of Texas to do that. It's Texas' problem. It's their responsibility. The same thing as Florida. In Florida, it's their problem, their responsibility to take care of their infrastructure, their immigration problem. As long as they don't have that sense of the federal government backing or privilege or showing privilege. And, that also comes to, you're giving privilege to one state and you're denying it to another state. And that's not the basic principles of federalism. And, one thing that I like to point out is that the word federalism and the word nullification has become dirty words in the English language, and that from both sides, from both left and the right, and I'm trying to really bring back those two words because those two words serve a purpose in this country: federalism and nullification. And when people don't want to acknowledge, and all I hear is secession. Oh well, Texas has the right to secede, or secession this, secession that. I'm like, why? Why are we even talking about secession again? It didn't work for a stupid cause with the Confederacy. It's not going to work again. Use the word federalism, define the word federalism, define the word nullification, and I can guarantee you that states will be more open by then. Now, what I don't want to see is when there is a Republican administration in the federal government and then the governors of several states are going to bow down to it. I don't want to see that. I want them to be as defiant and refuse to cooperate with the Republican administration just as a Democrat administration.
Yeah. Wholeheartedly. Bad public policy is not just a Democrat thing. Republicans are very capable of implementing bad public policy, and we've seen that from the federal government before. Now, I would argue that, one side, usually it's from the Democratic Party, that usually they implement more bad public policy, but still, I really believe that the states should have that right to stand up, whether it's a Republican, Democrat, or heck, if we get an independent or somebody else in there who makes bad public policy that goes against, A, the Constitution, or B, what one state really wants. They shouldn't have to, enforce the federal law like that. So, hands down, man. It's reclaiming that, and I think kudos to you for reclaiming those words, because they have been bastardized and they've been stolen and even redefined. And language is important in a culture and a civilization. And it's important to retain the original meaning and the intent of those words, so that future generations can use it properly and govern functionally and govern honestly too. I think that's another important thing.
Yeah, no, it really is, and it's a darn shame that we've seen it all across this country nowadays, and even before. I would say is when state schools and local schools started moving their civics curriculum into a social studies curriculum. That's where we've seen a change in people's minds and thinking, and I never thought about it, but I wish I would have been in that curriculum when they taught civics and not social studies. And if you hear the sound social studies, it sounds like it's a word Dr. Spock, the famous liberal doctor, would have coined. Social studies, a very, gender neutral or something, something strange to that effect. So, one point I like to make is that in my one of my college classes, it was state and local government. My political science professor always said, well, I know that we have a state government in Tallahassee and Georgia has Atlanta, but all directives come from Washington, D.C. And I raised my hand and I said, so what's the point of this class? If all policy comes to D.C., then why have a policy in Tallahassee or Georgia or Springfield? And she just couldn't give me an answer. So, that was a BS thing that she said and all that. But, again, not all directives come from D.C. There are some directives that come from D.C. and that's, Treasury and state and defense. But apart from that, healthcare, Social Security, immigration, all that should rely. All that directive should come from each individual state with no federal government funding.
Yeah, no, wholeheartedly, and that's a very valid point, and it's something that I think speaks volumes of, not to. I don't know what your opinion was of your teacher, but not to make their commentary on them individually, but maybe a commentary more on the state of the education system that she probably went through or he probably went through. That's kind of like it sounds like a Cliff Note version, right? Like a wrong Cliff Note version. Like, everything that just comes from DC. And it creates this, to somebody who's uneducated, that sounds like a very plausible thing, right? Like you hear about Washington, you hear about Congress and the president and the Senate all the time on television. You hardly hear about what's going on in your own state capitol, let alone at your city hall or at your school district headquarters, So, it's kind of bringing it back and here locally, but you're also trying to tell people, and it's kind of weird because, I feel like you and I and Seth, I've had this conversation with Seth a million times. It's like you kind of walk out there and everybody's kind of like a zombie and they're walking around like, oh, President Trump, President Biden. You want to shake them, right? You want to shake them and go, what they're doing right now in Washington, D.C., 99% of the time has no bearing on what happened right here, where you're standing in your community. Do you know what's going on down in Springfield? And they probably tell you no. Do you know when you even vote in a local election? Which up here it's April of every odd year. So next April they're going to vote, and we're going to get 10% turnout again, maybe even less than that. So it's like trying to wake these people up and shake them and get them out of this whole notion that DC is going to solve everything, that everything important happens in DC, when in reality it's not. It's just a bunch of unimpressive people who stand around and, think they're important and go to expensive cocktail parties, and pass these laws that are, a lot of them are largely symbolic unless it has something to do with our finances, because we feel that every year. But yeah, I mean, you just got to wake these people up. You got to shake them. Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, there's just so many of those people that just need that shaking, and they need that, what is it, the red pill or the blue pill from the Matrix?
Yeah, that's
right?
Yeah. Absolutely. There's a lot of people that are zombies and they just, they just go one side or the other side, but, never, and they just think that, they treat the federal government as if it was a celebrity, and they treat candidates and senators as celebrity status. And, that's why I hate and despise the 17th Amendment, because that has created this celebrity status that, it made Barack Obama into a celebrity status when he ran for Senate in 2004. And then other senators as well, John Edwards when he was running for Senate. So, this celebrity status is so, annoying that, people are not realizing the basic functions of that. And this is one of them. This is one of them, that the federal government has no function in the border situation. Never has been, never has. And I encourage people to, go to Amazon, check out my books, check out Chapter 4 of Across State Lines and Immigration, and they'll see that, the federal government has no authority in enforcing the Naturalization Clause or any aspect of the clause itself. The Commerce Clause is one that has been, I told this to a couple of people, it's like they're mangling it, and they mangled it to their own liking. The Commerce Clause or the Naturalization Clause is that they mangled it up, and they included ICE and INS and all that, and it's all mangled and teared, and it's kind of sad how people don't really realize that. So, I mean, I truly hope that people realize that what the federal government are doing is not the solution. Biden's not the solution. Trump's not the solution. Abbott, for once, I mean, if he stays like this, and if Trump gets in, I hope that he doesn't bow down to Trump and now let Trump take the reins. Stay the course and all that. It's up to each individual state. If California doesn't want to do that, then let them all go to California. If one sadly moves on to another state and commits a crime, well, then it's that state that will bring him to justice and up to that code of that state. But it's up to each individual state to maintain purity within the Constitution and the Union of sovereign states. And that's like my final conclusion is that know what your state's powers are and what the federal government consists of. And let's hope that people have a wake-up call and don't take the red pill or the blue pill. Just have a wake-up call with a large, giant cup of coffee and see how that goes.
Yeah. It's, I guess really the other thing, too, would be, in the world where states have their, the right to enforce immigration status, who decides, if I can, I know I'm kind of pressing a little bit more, but I'm very naturally kind of curious, who sets like the immigration standard and the process to become an American citizen? Like, how would that work?
Well, that was based in 1857, where Dred Scott moved to Wisconsin from Missouri, and his slave master died, and the state of Wisconsin was a free state, and so they granted him papers and citizenship papers. If it wasn't because of the Supreme Court and a very nasty Chief Justice, Roger Taney, Wisconsin could have set the precedent that states have a right to enforce the Naturalization Clause, and that John C. Calhoun would stand today as a freest statement known to Calhoun. But because he spoke about the Oregon Territory and Oregon slave and all that, and slave territories and all that, that statement has kind of like gone down the deep end. But if the Supreme Court, the federal court, wouldn't have ruled against Wisconsin, then Wisconsin would have set that precedent that moved on to other states. I think even Pennsylvania had that same precedent of giving citizenship papers and freedom papers to runaway slaves and escaped slaves into Pennsylvania. So it's up to that state to set those standards. It's not up to the federal government.
Well, and quite frankly, it might actually be a lot easier to understand. I know personally, I have a very good friend. Went to school with her. She was out of the country legally, but when I was in high school, she after high school she moved back to Mexico in Puebla. And at one time she reached out, she's like, hey, how do I become an American citizen? And I was like, oh, this should be pretty easy. And I was a lot more confused trying to figure it out from, federal government's website. State governments might actually streamline it. I mean, it's kind of a novel idea.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, absolutely. Because you get that web of tangled with the federal government that they create this and they create that and this loophole and that loophole that just, it's a madness of that. But I think states have that power. So if, like I said, read on the tyranny of the federal government, on Roger Taney, on the Immigration, on the Alien and Sedition Act, the China Exclusion Act, etc. And, you will see it's the federal government that has created this sense of totalitarianism and tyranny on that. So that's my last thing, my last conclusion on this for tonight is know what your state's rights are, know what your state's sovereign rights, and let's hope they open it up more to create more immigration laws for the states and not protecting the federal law. I don't know, Cody, what's your last conclusion on this?
My last conclusion on this is, first off, Federico, this has just been a conversation that, I've never been somebody really big into immigration law or policy or kind of getting into what it actually means. And I'm a big believer in when you actually look at something, trying to understand it and get down to the why, the need for it. And this conversation has, in my life, and I can't stress this enough, it has actually been one of the most eye-opening conversations I've had genuine, eye-opening and genuine conversations about immigration. And I really hope that, the listeners and what people could take away from this is to keep an open mind and don't be afraid to challenge the orthodoxy, because maybe the orthodoxy that we currently have is not the best way forward. And maybe it was what the founders truly intended.
Yeah, I do believe so, and thanks, Cody, for those kind words. And also, this also has been very stimulating with open debate and open friendliness, and I hope people will take this account, listen to this segment of, who controls the borders and all that. And I do hope people start to listen more to our discussions, because it's open and honest and good debates. And we'll be back next Sunday. I believe Seth will join us again next Sunday. And Cody, it's always great to have you. And may you have a good week ahead. And everybody have yourself a great night.
Thanks, Federico. You as well. Have a good week, everyone.